Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
The day before the Legacy Gala, the Vance estate smelled of floor wax and forced elegance. It was a cloying, heavy scent that seemed designed to mask the rot beneath the floorboards. Elena Vance stood on the second-floor landing, her fingers grazing the cool mahogany railing as she watched a small army of caterers transform the foyer into a shrine for her brother's ego. Below, Julian Vance was in his element, barking orders at a terrified florist while adjusting his silk tie in every passing reflective surface. He looked up, catching her gaze, and his lip curled into that familiar, predatory smirk. He didn't see a threat. He saw a ghost he had already exorcised. "Still here, Elena," Julian's voice carried across the marble hall, cutting through the frantic chatter of the staff. "I thought you'd be halfway to a studio apartment in the city by now, or perhaps a shelter. I hear they're quite accommodating for the academically displaced." A few of the senior staff, people who had served their mother for decades, looked away in collective shame. Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the small, encrypted drive in her pocket, a cold, hard rectangle of truth that Silas had helped her secure from the archives Julian thought he'd burned. "The gala is tomorrow, Julian," she said, her voice dropping into the foyer like a stone into a still pond. "Are you sure you're ready for the legacy to be the center of attention? Some things are better left in the dark." Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He stepped toward the stairs, his expensive Italian loafers clicking rhythmically against the stone. "The dark is where you live now, sister. I've spent 5 years building this foundation. Do you really think your little concerns about my management style are going to move the needle? The board sees the numbers. They see the Vance name at the top of the sector. They don't care about the sentimental ramblings of a woman who couldn't even protect her own research." He reached the landing, invading her personal space with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he owned the air she breathed. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of the scotch he'd been sipping since noon. "You should check the safe in the study, Julian," Elena whispered, leaning in just enough to see the flicker of annoyance in his pupils. "The one behind the portrait of grandfather. You might find that some sentimental ramblings have a way of becoming legal precedents when the right eyes see them." For a heartbeat, the arrogance wavered. His eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine vitriol crossing his features before he smoothed it over with a mask of bored contempt. "I changed that code months ago." "You're reaching, Elena. It's pathetic. Go to your room. Try not to embarrass me tomorrow by wearing something that looks like it came from a clearance rack." He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence entirely as he went back to berating the florist. Elena watched him go, her pulse steady. She wasn't the one who should be worried about embarrassment. She moved down the hall toward the west wing, the sound of her own footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She needed to see Evelyn Vance. The medication Julian had been insisting upon was supposedly for her mother's declining cognitive health, but Dr. Eris Thorne had confirmed Elena's darkest suspicions an hour ago over a secure line. The dosage was 3 times what was necessary for a woman of her age, designed not to heal, but to haze. As she reached the heavy oak doors of the master suite, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Marcus Vance standing in the shadows of the gallery. Julian's son looked nothing like his father in that moment. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes darting toward the foyer where his father's voice still boomed. "He's going to do it, isn't he?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He's going to announce the sale of the research wing tomorrow night. He said it's trimming the fat." Elena looked at her nephew. He was a Vance by blood, but he hadn't yet learned the cruelty that usually came with the name. "He's going to try, Marcus, but your father forgets that fat is what protects the heart. Without that research, this company is just a hollow shell with a fancy logo." Marcus looked at her, his gaze lingering on her hands. They weren't shaking. For the first time in years, the aunt he had known as a frazzled, overworked scientist looked like she was holding a winning hand. "You're not scared of him anymore," he noted, a touch of awe in his voice. "It's hard to be afraid of a man when you realize he's just a child playing with matches in a house made of paper," she replied. She entered her mother's room, the scent of lavender and antiseptic hitting her instantly. Evelyn sat by the window, staring out at the manicured gardens with glazed, distant eyes. Silas was there, adjusting the silk throw over her knees. He looked up as Elena entered, a silent understanding passing between them. He had been the one to provide the keys, the one to whisper the locations of the hidden ledgers, and the one to document the vitamins Julian hand-delivered every morning. "She's had a quiet afternoon, Miss Elena," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "Master Julian was in earlier. He seemed agitated." "He has reason to be," Elena said, kneeling beside her mother. She took Evelyn's hand. It was thin and papery, the skin translucent. "Mother, can you hear me? Tomorrow is the gala. Everything is going to change. You won't have to take the bitter tea anymore, I promise." Evelyn's fingers gave a microscopic squeeze. It was the only sign of life, but it was enough. Elena spent the next hour with Dr. Thorne in the small library, finalizing the documents. The air in the room was cool and still, the only sound the scratching of a fountain pen against high-quality vellum. Eris Thorne was a man of few words, but his reputation for integrity was the one thing Julian hadn't been able to buy. "The blood work is indisputable, Elena," Thorne said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The chemical markers in your mother's system don't match the prescriptions on file. If this goes before the board or the authorities, Julian won't just lose the company. He'll lose his freedom." "He thinks he's untouchable because he's a Vance," Elena said, her eyes scanning the lab results. "He's spent so long looking down at everyone that he's forgotten what's happening at his feet." "The gala is a bold choice for a reveal," Thorne noted. "There will be over 200 witnesses. The press, the investors, the city's elite. There's no coming back from that." "That's the point, Eris. Julian loves an audience. It's only fair he has one for his final act." As evening fell, the house transitioned from chaotic preparation to a tense, expectant silence. The catering staff had departed, leaving the foyer a glittering cavern of crystal and white lilies. Elena stood on the balcony of her room, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. She could hear Julian in the room below hers, his voice muffled but sharp as he argued with someone on the phone. He was likely talking to the legal team about the merger, unaware that the very foundation of that deal was being dismantled piece by piece. She thought back to the way he had mocked her in the foyer, the way he had looked at her as if she were a stain on the family tapestry. He had spent his life weaponizing their father's legacy, using the Vance name as a shield for his own inadequacies. He didn't realize that a shield was only as strong as the person holding it. Elena walked back inside and opened her wardrobe. Hanging there was a dress she had bought with the last of her savings, a deep, midnight blue silk that felt like armor. Beside it lay the folder, the drive, and the sworn statement from Silas. She sat at her small desk and picked up a pen. She didn't have a speech prepared. She didn't need one. The truth didn't require flourish. It only required a voice. A soft knock came at her door. It was Silas. He didn't enter, merely stood in the doorway, his shadow long and thin against the hardwood. "The master has retired for the night, Miss Elena," he said. "He's instructed the staff that no one is to disturb him until the morning. He wants to be perfect for his big day." "Thank you, Silas. You should get some rest too. Tomorrow will be a long day for everyone." "I've waited 10 years for a day like tomorrow, miss," the old man said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I think I can manage a few more hours of wakefulness." When he left, Elena turned off the lights. She didn't go to bed. She sat by the window, watching the moonlight silver the grounds. Tomorrow, the sleeping lion would wake up. Tomorrow, the Vance legacy would finally be defined not by the man who stole it, but by the woman who saved it. She touched the drive one last time, the cold metal a promise of the storm to come. Julian thought he was hosting a celebration. He had no idea he was attending a funeral. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, the countdown officially hit 0. The day of the legacy gala had arrived. Elena closed her eyes, not out of exhaustion, but for a final moment of peace before the war began. She could almost hear the sound of the first crack in the foundation. It was a beautiful sound. The next morning, the Vance estate was a hive of synthetic perfection. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the breakfast room, illuminating the dust motes that dared to dance in the air Julian Vance considered his own. Elena stood by the sideboard, her fingers grazing the cool, polished marble. She had barely slept, her mind a repeating loop of the files she had decrypted at midnight, but her exhaustion was masked by a terrifyingly sharp clarity. Julian sat at the head of the mahogany table, the scent of expensive espresso and imported oranges surrounding him like a fortress. He didn't look up from his tablet as she approached. He didn't have to. His power was a physical weight in the room, designed to make everyone else feel small, a temporary guest in his undisputed kingdom. "The catering staff is arriving at 10, he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. He finally looked up, his eyes scanning her simple linen dress with a flick of practiced disdain. "Try to stay out of the way, Elena. You have a habit of cluttering the aesthetic of this house. Today is about the Vance legacy, not your misplaced sense of belonging." "I understand the importance of today perfectly, Julian," she replied. Her voice was steady, a contrast to the acidic remark. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her hidden pocket, a small piece of metal that felt heavier than the entire manor. He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "Do you? You're here because of my mother's fading mind and my misplaced sense of charity. Don't mistake a roof over your head for a seat at the table. You're a ghost in this house, and ghosts should remain silent." The first rage spike hit her, a hot flash of indignation that she suppressed with the practiced ease of a martyr. He spoke as if he hadn't spent the last decade systematically dismantling the very legacy he claimed to protect. He spoke as if he hadn't turned his own mother into a prisoner in her own skin. "I'll go check on Evelyn," she said, turning before he could dismiss her further. "See that she's presentable for the gala tonight," Julian called after her, his attention already back on his screen. "I won't have her looking like a common invalid in front of the board members. Marcus is already complaining about the smell of that medicinal tea you force on her." Elena didn't answer. She climbed the grand staircase, her hand trailing on the gold leaf banister. The house smelled of lilies, white, funeral-cold lilies that Julian insisted on having in every room. To the world, they were a symbol of purity and wealth. To Elena, they smelled like the rot hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside Evelyn's suite, the air was different. It was heavy and stagnant. Evelyn Vance sat in her armchair by the window, her eyes fixed on a point in the garden that only she could see. On the nightstand sat a porcelain cup filled with a dark, murky liquid. Elena picked up the cup. The scent hit her immediately, a cloying chemical bitterness masked by honey. This was the bitter water, the sedative Julian had been using to keep his mother in a state of compliant fog. He called it vitamin therapy to the staff. Elena knew it was a chemical leash. "Good morning, Evelyn," she whispered, her heart aching as she poured the liquid into a hidden container she carried. She replaced it with fresh, clear tea she had prepared herself. Evelyn's hand twitched. For a second, the fog in her eyes seemed to thin. "The lion," the older woman rasped, her voice a dry whisper. "The lion is tired, Elena. The lion is waking up," she promised, squeezing the woman's frail hand. "Just a few more hours." The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway signaled the arrival of the next generation of arrogance. Marcus Vance pushed the door open without knocking. He was a younger, cruder version of his father, wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than a researcher's annual salary. He held a phone to his ear, laughing loudly before snapping it shut. "Still hovering over the gargoyle?" Marcus asked, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at his grandmother with the same interest one might afford a piece of outdated furniture. "Dad wants to know if the nursemaid has finished the seating charts. He's losing his mind because the senator changed his RSVP. "I'm nearly finished, Marcus," she said, standing tall. He walked into the room, his expensive sneakers squeaking on the hardwood. He picked up a silver hairbrush from the vanity, turning it over in his hand. You know, Elena, I almost feel bad for you. You spend all this time playing house, thinking you're part of the inner circle. But tonight is the coronation. Once the merger is signed, Dad's selling this mausoleum. You'll be looking for a new place to haunt by Monday. He dropped the brush. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the silver backing denting slightly. He didn't even blink. Don't look so shocked. It's just business. Something people like you don't really grasp. I grasp more than you think, she said, her voice dropping an octave. She looked him directly in the eye, a move that usually made Marcus uncomfortable. Business is about leverage, isn't it? Knowing exactly what a thing is worth before you break it. Marcus narrowed his eyes, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before his habitual smugness returned. Sure, whatever helps you sleep in the servants' quarters. Just make sure the old lady doesn't drool on the guests. He sauntered out, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and entitlement in his wake. Elena waited until his footsteps faded before she picked up the brush. She smoothed Evelyn's hair, her mind racing. Julian was selling the house. He was planning to liquidate the family's history and disappear with the proceeds, leaving his mother to rot in a high-end facility and Elena with nothing. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a child. He didn't realize she had already flipped the board. By mid-afternoon, the manor was crawling with vendors. The sound of silver clinking against crystal echoed through the foyer as the grand ballroom was prepared. Julian was in his element, barking orders at the decorators, his voice a whip that kept everyone in a state of frantic submission. Elena was crossing the hall with a stack of place cards when Julian intercepted her. He was standing with the lead event planner and two prominent donors who had arrived early. "Ah, Elena," Julian said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the small group. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. "I was just telling Mr. Sterling about our resident charity case. Elena here was a lab assistant who fell on hard times. We couldn't let her wander the streets, given her history with the family." The donors looked at her with a mix of pity and boredom. The event planner didn't even look up from her clipboard. "She's been quite useful with the menial tasks," Julian continued, his smirk widening as he saw the flicker of fire in her eyes. "In fact, Elena, why don't you show Mr. Sterling how well you've mastered the silver? The dessert forks in the dining room look a bit dull. A little elbow grease from a grateful heart would go a long way." The wait for it moment hummed in her blood. She could see the reflection of the grand chandelier in Julian's eyes, a man who believed he was untouchable. He was publicly branding her as a servant, a failure, a nobody. "Of course, Julian," she said, her voice dripping with a subtext he was too arrogant to hear. "I'll make sure everything is polished to a mirror finish. I want everyone to see themselves clearly tonight, especially you." Julian chuckled, patting her shoulder condescendingly before turning back to his guests. "See, loyal to a fault. Now about that 1945 vintage we'll be opening for the toast." Elena walked toward the dining room, her heart hammering a steady rhythm of vengeance. She felt the cold condensation of a water glass on a passing tray, the texture of the fine linen napkins, the smell of the floor wax and the lilies. Everything was in place. She reached into her pocket and felt the drive. The countdown was no longer in days or hours. It was in minutes. The legacy gala was the stage Julian had built for his greatest triumph. He had no idea he had simply built his own scaffold. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the Vance estate, Elena stood in the shadows of the gallery. Below, the first cars were pulling up the long, winding driveway. The elite of the city were arriving, dressed in silk and diamonds, coming to celebrate a man who had built his throne on a foundation of theft and betrayal. She looked down at the place cards in her hand. Julian Vance, the man who thought he owned the world. Elena Vance. The woman who was about to take it back. The doors to the ballroom opened. The music began, a soaring orchestral piece that sounded like a victory march. Elena took a deep breath, the scent of the lilies no longer bothering her. Tonight, the bitter water would finally be swallowed by the man who brewed it. She turned and headed toward the stairs, her steps silent, her resolve absolute. The gala had begun. 2 days had passed since the gala's opening fanfare, but the stench of Julian's expensive cigars still seemed to cling to the velvet curtains of the Vance manor. The house felt like a tomb of polished marble and whispered secrets, a place where the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the underlying metallic tang of cold ambition. Elena stood in the grand foyer, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool edge of her mahogany desk. She wasn't working on research today. She was waiting. The heavy front doors groaned open, admitting a gust of chilly autumn air and the man who currently considered himself the king of the city. Julian Vance strode in, his tailored wool coat billowing behind him. He didn't look at Elena. He never looked at her unless he intended to use her as a target for his frustrations. He tossed his leather briefcase onto the antique side table with a thud that echoed through the hall, a sound of casual ownership that made Elena's jaw tighten. "The board is still buzzing about the gala," Julian said, his voice booming with a self-satisfaction that bordered on the obscene. He didn't wait for a response as he began to peel off his gloves. "I've secured 3 new major investors. The Vance legacy is finally back in capable hands. Not that you'd understand the complexities of high-level finance, Elena. You've always been more comfortable with your dusty books and your charitable inclinations." He turned then, his eyes sharp and dismissive. "Speaking of which, I've made a decision regarding Mother. The private wing is an unnecessary expense. I've found a facility in the north. It's specialized for her condition. They'll take her on Monday." The blood in Elena's veins turned to ice. She knew what specialized meant in Julian's vocabulary. It meant out of sight and out of mind, a place where Evelyn Vance would be tucked away in a sterile room, her dementia managed by the very drugs Julian had been slipping into her tea for months. "Monday is only 3 days away, Julian," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady. She focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, refusing to let the tremor in her heart reach her hands. She lived in this house for 40 years. Moving her so abruptly could be catastrophic for her mental state. Julian let out a short, sharp laugh that contained no mirth. "Her mental state? Elena, the woman doesn't know what day it is. She stares at the walls and babbles about the past. She's a ghost haunting her own hallways. It's time we put the ghost to rest." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of stale scotch and expensive cologne rolling off him in waves. "And while we're on the subject of ghosts, you should start thinking about your own future. Once Mother is settled, your services as a companion will no longer be required. I've already had my lawyers draft a severance package. It's more than you deserve, frankly, considering how little you've actually contributed to this family." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be patronizing, but felt like a threat. "Don't look so shocked. You knew this day was coming. People like you are temporary, Elena. You're the filler in the story, not the lead. I suggest you take the money and find a nice, quiet library somewhere. You don't belong in a house of this stature." He turned on his heel and headed toward the stairs, his boots clicking rhythmically against the marble. He had no idea that every word he spoke was another nail in the coffin of his own making. Elena watched him go, her eyes tracking his ascent until he disappeared into the shadows of the 2nd floor. "He's gone to his club for the evening," a low voice whispered from the shadows of the dining room. Silas emerged, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, but his eyes were burning with a quiet, righteous fire. He held something in his hand, wrapped in a plain linen cloth. He approached Elena with the silent grace of a man who had spent decades navigating the halls of power without being noticed. "He thinks he's won," Silas said, handing the bundle to her. "He thinks the gala was the final move. He's become careless in his arrogance." Elena unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a heavy, tarnished brass key, the key to the Victorian-era safe hidden behind the false back of the library's built-in shelving. It was the one place Julian kept the records he didn't want the digital world to see. "The red ledger," Elena whispered, the weight of the key feeling like a weapon in her palm. "He's been drugging her since the spring," Silas said, his voice cracking with a rare moment of emotion. I've kept the vials he discarded. I've logged the times. But the ledger, that's where he kept the accounts. He's been siphoning the estate's trust to cover his losses in the overseas markets. He's not just a bad son, Elena. He's a thief. Elena nodded, her resolve hardening into something indestructible. We only have 72 hours before he moves her. If she leaves this house, we lose our strongest witness. Then we move tonight, Silas replied. They moved through the darkened manor like shadows. The library was a cavern of silence, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the seconds of Julian's reign. Elena approached the shelves, her fingers finding the hidden catch Silas had described. With a soft click, a section of the oak paneling swung inward, revealing the iron face of a safe that predated the house itself. Her hands were cold as she fitted the brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying thud. The door swung open, releasing a puff of air that smelled of old parchment and dry rot. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a thick, leather-bound volume with a crimson cover. The Red Ledger. Elena pulled it out, the leather feeling rough and ancient under her fingertips. She opened it on the library table, the light from her small flashlight illuminating the pages. It was all there. Julian's handwriting, neat and precise, detailing every transaction. The consulting fees paid to a Dr. Eris Thorne, the man who had been prescribing the heavy sedatives for Evelyn. The transfers from the Vance Foundation into offshore accounts. But there was more. Elena's breath hitched as she turned to the back of the book. There, tucked between the pages, was a copy of a second will, one dated after the version Julian had used to seize control of the estate. It was signed by Evelyn Vance and witnessed by Silas and a lawyer Julian had long since driven out of town. He didn't destroy it, Elena whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He kept it. He was so sure no one would ever find this that he kept the evidence of his own fraud. He's a narcissist, Silas said, standing guard at the door. He couldn't bear to part with the proof of how clever he thought he was. Elena flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the dates. Julian had been systematic, slowly draining the life out of the estate and his mother simultaneously. He had planned this for years, waiting for the moment he could step into the vacuum of power. She felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He had looked at her today and called her filler. He had mocked her mother's fading mind while he was the one holding the needle. He had stood in this very room and bragged about a legacy he had systematically dismantled. "I have everything," Elena said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. She pulled a small digital camera from her pocket and began to photograph every page, every signature, every incriminating line of text. The flash was a series of rhythmic pulses in the dark, each one a strike against Julian's fortress of lies. "What's the next step?" Silas asked. Elena closed the ledger and tucked it back into the safe, locking it tight. She handed the key back to Silas. "We wait. Julian thinks Monday is the day he gets rid of his problems. He's invited the board members and the press to the manor on Sunday afternoon for a legacy announcement. He wants to show the world he's the benevolent protector of the Vance name before he ships his mother off to that facility." She looked at the digital camera in her hand, the small device containing the power to bring an empire to its knees. 2 days, Elena said, her eyes reflecting the cold moonlight streaming through the library windows. 2 days until Julian Vance realizes that the woman he dismissed as a sleeping lion has finally woken up. He thinks he's hosting a celebration. He doesn't realize he's invited everyone to witness his own execution. She walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling, manicured lawn of the estate. In the distance, the city lights twinkled, oblivious to the storm brewing within the manor walls. Julian was likely at his club right now, sipping expensive scotch and laughing with his enablers, completely unaware that the foundation of his world had just turned to ash. Elena felt a strange, icy calm. The fear that had lived in her chest for months was gone, replaced by a singular, focused purpose. She wasn't just doing this for herself, or even for the career Julian had tried to destroy. She was doing it for the woman upstairs who was being erased one dose at a time. "Silas," she said, not turning from the window. Yes, Miss Elena. Make sure Dr. Thorne is on the guest list for Sunday. I want him to have a front row seat. Consider it done. Elena reached into her pocket and touched the small, silver locket her mother had given her years ago. The scent of lilies was gone now, replaced by the sharp, clean smell of impending justice. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in her life, Elena Vance wasn't afraid of the ending. She was the one writing it. The Saturday sun bled a bruised purple across the manicured lawns of the Vance estate, casting long, skeletal shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand gallery. It was the evening before the annual Heritage Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of the Vance social calendar, and the house hummed with the frantic, suppressed energy of a ticking bomb. Elena Vance stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold, polished mahogany of the railing. Below, in the great hall, a small army of caterers moved with hushed precision, laying silk cloths over tables that would soon hold the weight of the city's elite. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax, a combination that usually made her throat tighten with a sense of suffocating tradition. Today, however, it smelled like the sterile stillness before a storm. Still lurking in the corners, I see. The voice was like a splash of acid. Elena didn't need to turn to know Julian Vance had entered the gallery. She heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of his Italian leather loafers on the hardwood, a sound that used to make her heart race with anxiety. Now, it merely registered as a frequency she had learned to tune out. He came to stand beside her, the smell of peaty Isla Scotch trailing him like a foul omen. He looked every bit the master of the domain, his tuxedo jacket perfectly tailored to hide the rot beneath. He didn't look at her. He looked down at the hall, surveying his kingdom with the hungry eyes of a man who believed he had finally silenced every ghost in his closet. "Tomorrow is a big day for the family, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with a forced, paternal warmth that felt like grease. "I've invited the board of the Research Institute. I'm announcing the new direction for the foundation. It's a shame your mother won't be coherent enough to witness it. She always did love a good spectacle." Elena's grip tightened on the railing, her knuckles turning a sharp, skeletal white. "My mother is more aware than you give her credit for, Julian. Perhaps more than you'd like her to be." Julian let out a short, barking laugh that echoed unpleasantly against the high ceiling. He finally turned to her, his eyes narrowing with a familiar, sharp-edged contempt. "Aware? The woman can barely remember her own name most mornings. It's a mercy, really. She doesn't have to witness your spectacular failure as a daughter or as a scientist. You've spent months caring for her, and for what? You're a glorified nurse in a house that's already forgotten you were ever gone." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the heat of his arrogance radiating off him. "Don't think I haven't noticed you whispering with the help, Elena. Silas is an old man with a soft heart, but even he knows who signs the checks. If you're planning some pathetic little scene for tomorrow, some plea for more inheritance or a seat at the table, save yourself the embarrassment. You don't belong at that table. You never did." Elena turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm that seemed to unsettle him for a fleeting second. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch the corners of her mouth. "You're right about one thing, Julian," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "Tomorrow will be a spectacle, but you should be careful with that scotch. It's a long way down from the pedestal you've built for yourself, and the air is getting remarkably thin." Julian's face flushed a deep, angry crimson, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped in his cheek. He opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort, but he was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Marcus Vance stood at the top of the stairs, watching them with a troubled expression. He looked between his father and his aunt, his hand nervously tapping against the crystal glass he held. At 24, Marcus still carried the soft features of a boy who had been told what to think his entire life, but lately his eyes had begun to hold a flicker of something else. Doubt. "Father," Marcus said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "The legal team is in the study. They have the final papers for the trust liquidation ready for your signature." Julian straightened his jacket, the mask of the powerful patriarch sliding back into place instantly. He spared one last, dismissive glance at Elena. See, the world moves on regardless of your delusions. Try not to trip over the caterers on your way to the attic. He strode away, his heavy footsteps retreating toward the study. Marcus lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on Elena. He looked like he wanted to say something, to ask a question that had been burning in the back of his mind since he'd seen her standing over their grandmother's bed with a look of fierce, protective clarity. "Aunt Elena," Marcus asked softly, "is everything okay? You've been different lately, the way you look at him, it's like you're waiting for something." Elena looked at her nephew, the son of the man who had tried to erase her. She saw the Vance features in his face, but she also saw the gentleness of the grandmother he was being told to forget. "I'm not waiting anymore, Marcus," she said, reaching out to briefly touch his arm. "I'm just making sure the guest list is perfect. You should get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day for everyone in this house." Marcus frowned, his confusion deepening, but he nodded and followed his father. Elena waited until the sound of the study door slamming shut echoed through the gallery. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over a contact labeled simply, "The Architect." She didn't call. Instead, she walked down the back staircase, avoiding the main hall where the bustle was loudest. She found Silas in the small, dimly lit pantry off the kitchen. He was polishing a set of silver service trays, his movements slow and methodical. "The doctor is confirmed," Elena whispered. Silas didn't look up, but his hands paused for a fraction of a second. "Dr. Aris Thorne will be here at 8 sharp, Miss Elena. He's bringing the original medical files from the 2018 intake. The ones your brother thought were destroyed in the office fire. And the board members." "Every single one," Silas replied, his voice a gravelly rasp of satisfaction. "They're expecting a presentation on the new Vance Legacy wing. They have no idea they're about to attend an inquest." Elena felt a sharp, cold jolt of adrenaline. She reached into her other pocket and touched the small, silver locket. She could feel the intricate engravings beneath her fingertips, the initials of her mother, Evelyn Vance, before Julian had turned her into a ghost in her own home. "He thinks he's liquidating the trust tonight," Elena said, more to herself than to Silas. "Let him sign," Silas said, finally looking up. His eyes were hard, reflecting the dull silver of the tray. "A signature on a fraudulent document is just more rope for the noose." Elena nodded and left the pantry, moving through the shadows of the house she had once loved and now barely recognized. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, to the room where her mother lay in a twilight sleep, her breathing thin and shallow. She sat by the bed, taking the older woman's hand. The room smelled of lavender and the faint, metallic tang of the medication Julian insisted on administering. "Just one more night," Elena whispered into the silence. "Tomorrow, the windows stay open. Tomorrow, we stop hiding." Outside, the last of the purple light vanished, swallowed by a thick, oppressive blackness. A storm was rolling in from the coast, the first distant rumble of thunder vibrating through the floorboards of the manor. Elena sat in the dark, watching the clock on the bedside table. The red numbers blinked steadily, counting down the hours until the sun rose on the end of the Vance Dynasty. Julian was in the study, celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. He was laughing, drinking, and signing his own downfall with a gold-plated pen. Elena closed her eyes and listened to the rain begin to lash against the glass. It was a cold, cleansing sound. The stage was set, the witnesses were summoned, and for the first time in 10 years, the predator in the study was the one being hunted. The evening of the Vance Foundation Gala arrived with a stillness that felt like a held breath. After the torrential storm of the previous night, the air was scrubbed clean, cold and sharp enough to sting the lungs. Inside the grand ballroom of the manor, the atmosphere was the polar opposite. It was a stifling, gilded cage of heat, expensive perfume, and the heavy, cloying scent of thousands of white lilies. Elena stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, her hand resting lightly on the cold iron railing. She didn't look like the woman who had spent the last decade shrinking into the shadows of this house. She wore a gown of deep, midnight emerald, a color Julian had always forbidden, claiming it clashed with the Vance aesthetic. It was sleek, architectural, and possessed a weight that made her feel armored. Beneath the silk, tucked into a hidden pocket of her clutch, sat the digital drive Silas had delivered an hour ago. It was a small, cold piece of plastic that held the weight of 1,000 sins. She took a slow, steady breath. The sound of a string quartet drifted up from the foyer, playing something intricate and soulless. Below, the elite of the city moved like schools of brightly colored fish, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. At the center of it all, standing beneath the massive crystal chandelier, was Julian. He was holding court, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and his other gesturing expansively as he spoke to a group of board members. From this distance, he looked every bit the powerful, grieving son and visionary leader. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his hair perfectly silvered at the temples, his smile practiced and predatory. He looked like a man who owned the world because, until tonight, he did. "You look like a different person," a voice whispered beside her. Elena didn't turn. She knew the cadence of Marcus's voice. Her stepson stood a few feet away, looking uncomfortable in his formal wear. He looked older than he had a week ago, the boyish arrogance replaced by a haunting sort of clarity. "I am a different person, Marcus," she said, her voice low and resonant. "And so are you." "He's going to announce the merger tonight," Marcus said, his eyes fixed on his father. "He's telling everyone the foundation is expanding. He's using the Vance legacy as the hook. It's a lie, Elena, all of it." "I know," she replied. She finally looked at him, seeing the conflict in his face. "Are you ready for what comes next? There is no going back once the lights go up." Marcus swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to where Silas stood near the service entrance, watchful and invisible. "I'm tired of being a Vance if this is what it means. I'll be in position." He disappeared into the crowd, leaving Elena alone for one final moment of silence. She touched the emerald pendant at her throat, a piece that had belonged to Evelyn before Julian had locked her away in a fog of synthetic care. It was cold against her skin, a reminder of the woman currently sitting in the upstairs suite, finally clear-headed and waiting for the signal. Elena began her descent. The transition from the quiet of the landing to the roar of the ballroom was visceral. The heat hit her first, followed by the sound of hundreds of conversations competing for dominance. As she reached the final step, the sea of guests began to part. The whispers followed her like a wake. She wasn't the quiet Mrs. Vance tonight. She was a ghost who had finally decided to haunt the living. She made a point of walking directly toward Julian. He was mid-sentence, regaling Dr. Eris Thorne and two prominent city council members with a story about his latest charitable acquisition. When he saw her, his speech faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in the porcelain mask, before his eyes narrowed with a familiar, simmering rage. He didn't like being upstaged. He especially didn't like being upstaged by his fragile wife in a dress that screamed of independence. "Elena," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. He stepped forward, his hand clamping onto her elbow with a grip that was meant to bruise. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive grapes and cold ambition. "What is this? You look like you're heading to a funeral." "In a way, I am," she said, her smile never reaching her eyes. She didn't pull away. She simply looked at his hand until he felt the weight of the surrounding witnesses and forced himself to loosen his grip. "You're late," Julian hissed, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "And you're dressed like a common socialite. Where is the pearl set I bought you? The one that shows you have some respect for this family's standing." "The pearls felt a bit restrictive tonight, Julian," she said calmly. She turned her gaze to Dr. Thorne, who was watching the exchange with a clinical, detached interest. "Good evening, doctor. I trust the medication you've been providing for the family is working as intended." Thorne's expression didn't change, but his glass stilled in his hand. "The protocols are standard, Mrs. Vance. Results vary by patient." "Oh, I think the results are becoming quite clear," Elena said. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. He stepped between her and the doctor, his posture an attempt to physically erase her from the conversation. Go find some guests to entertain, Elena. Try not to embarrass me further with your moods. We have a legacy to secure tonight, and I won't have you ruin it with your theatrics." He turned back to the councilmen, dismissing her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been moved out of place. "My apologies, gentlemen. My wife has been under a great deal of stress lately. The mind is a delicate thing, isn't it?" The men chuckled, a sycophantic, hollow sound, and Elena felt the familiar spike of cold fury in her chest. It was the same dismissal he had used for years to gaslight her, to make her doubt her own reality while he dismantled her life piece by piece. But tonight, the rage didn't burn, it crystallized. She walked away, moving through the room with a purpose Julian was too arrogant to notice. She stopped by the buffet, where the scent of seared scallops and truffle oil was overwhelming. She caught Silas's eye across the room. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The technicians in the AV booth were his people now. The tribute video Julian had prepared to honor his own leadership had been replaced. Elena moved toward the far corner of the room, near the large mahogany doors that led to the library. She found Evelyn Vance sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, partially obscured by a decorative fern. The older woman looked frail, her hands trembling slightly in her lap, but her eyes were sharp. For the first time in years, the dementia Julian had so carefully cultivated through Thorne's prescriptions was absent. "Is it time, dear?" Evelyn asked, her voice a fragile thread of its former strength. "Almost, Evelyn," Elena whispered, kneeling beside her. "Are you sure you want to be here for this? It won't be easy to watch." Evelyn reached out, her thin fingers gripping Elena's hand with surprising force. Her skin felt like parchment, but her spirit was iron. "I watched him kill my husband's dream for 30 years. I watched him turn my grandson into a monster. I want to see the look on his face when he realizes he has nothing left but the dirt he stands on." Elena squeezed her hand and stood. She looked back at the center of the room. Julian was moving toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, the spotlight already beginning to track his movement. He looked triumphant. He looked like a king about to be crowned. He climbed the 3 steps to the podium, tapping the microphone. The sound rang through the hall, a sharp, metallic command for silence. The room obeyed. The quartet stopped playing. The laughter died down. Hundreds of people, the most powerful figures in the state, turned their attention to the man at the front. "Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests," Julian began, his voice projected with the practiced resonance of a man who believed his own lies. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a foundation. We celebrate the endurance of the Vance name. We celebrate a legacy of strength, of order, and of a future that is as bright as the history that precedes us." Elena moved into the center of the aisle, standing directly in his line of sight. She saw him spot her. He smiled, a condescending, victor's smile, thinking she was finally taking her place as the dutiful, silent wife. "But before we look to the future," Julian continued, his hand reaching for the remote on the podium, "I want to share a tribute, a look at the man who started it all and the values I have fought to protect every single day of my life." He clicked the button. The massive screen behind him hummed to life. The lights in the ballroom dimmed automatically, plunging the audience into a state of expectant silence. Julian turned slightly, his chest puffed out, waiting for the first images of his father and his own curated achievements to fill the space. Elena felt the weight of the digital drive in her clutch. She felt the eyes of Marcus and Silas on her from their respective corners. She felt the ghost of the woman she used to be finally leave the room. The screen didn't show the Vance family crest. It didn't show Julian shaking hands with governors or cutting ribbons at hospitals. It showed a grainy, high-definition feed of a dark office. It showed Julian Vance sitting at his desk 3 weeks ago, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop. The audio was crisp, cutting through the silence of the ballroom like a knife. "I don't care if the dosage is lethal over time, Thorne," Julian's recorded voice boomed through the speakers, cold and utterly devoid of humanity. "My mother is a relic. She's a drain on the estate and a liability to the merger. Just keep her quiet. Keep her confused." I'll handle the legalities of the power of attorney." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It was the sound of 300 people holding their breath as they realized they weren't watching a tribute. They were watching a confession. Julian froze. His hand was still on the podium, his body half turned toward the screen. The triumphant smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. In the harsh light of the projection, his face went a sickly, translucent gray. His mouth opened, a small, choked sound escaping his throat, but no words followed. Elena took a step forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown. The dinner party ghost had finally stopped hiding in the walls. She looked up at the man on the stage, the man who had stolen her life and tried to bury his own mother alive. "The toast is waiting, Julian," Elena said, her voice carrying through the absolute silence of the room, clear and cold as the winter air outside. "Don't you want to tell them more about your legacy?" Julian turned back to the crowd, his eyes wide and wild, searching for a way out, for a lie big enough to cover the truth. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, the board members, the councilmen, his own son, he didn't find supporters. He found witnesses. And for the first time in his life, the predator realized the cage door had been locked from the outside. The clock on the mantel chimed 10, the sound echoing like a funeral bell through the breathless hall. For 3 seconds, the only other noise was the frantic, mechanical whir of the projector cooling fan. Julian Vance stood frozen on the dais, his shadow stretched long and distorted across the very evidence that condemned him. The image on the screen, a grainy but unmistakable video of him switching his mother's medication for a clear, sedative liquid, pulsed with a digital heartbeat. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to dissolve. The arrogant lines around his mouth, carved by years of looking down at everyone, slackened into a grotesque mask of disbelief. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, became glassy, darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. A bead of sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a slow, jagged path through the heavy foundation he wore to hide his age, leaving a streak of raw, sickly skin exposed. His lower lip trembled, a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't stop, no matter how hard he clenched his jaw. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a ghost caught in the light of dawn. "This is a fabrication," Julian finally choked out, his voice cracking. He looked toward the head of the board, a man named Arthur who had been his father's closest friend. "Arthur, surely you see this for what it is. A disgruntled researcher, a woman who couldn't handle the pressure of the Vance legacy, trying to grift her way into a settlement." He turned his gaze to Elena, his eyes flaring with a desperate, dying spark of the old fire. "You're unstable, Elena. We all saw the reports. The stress of the research, the delusions. This is a hack, a deepfake. It has to be." Elena didn't flinch. She stood near the buffet table, the scent of expensive lilies and roasted lamb suddenly cloying in the stagnant air. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her evening bag, a small, cold comfort against her hip. She didn't need to scream. The truth was doing the screaming for her. "The reports you signed, Julian?" she asked, her voice steady and low, carrying easily through the silent room. "The ones Dr. Eris Thorne helped you draft while you kept Evelyn sedated in the East Wing." At the mention of his name, Dr. Eris Thorne, who had been trying to blend into the shadows near the bar, stiffened. He looked at the exit, but Silas, the old family steward, was already standing there, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. Silas had lived in this house for 40 years. He knew where every secret was buried, and he had finally handed Elena the shovel. "I have the toxicology results," Dr. Eris Thorne stammered, his sudden betrayal cutting through Julian's last defense like a blade. The doctor stepped forward, his hands shaking as he pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his jacket. "Julian, I told you the dosage was too high. You forced my hand. You said it was for her own protection, that she was a danger to the estate." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The board members, men and women who had toasted Julian's brilliance only 20 minutes ago, began to physically recoil. It was a subtle movement at first, a leaning back in chairs, a shifting of feet. But within seconds, a wide, empty circle had formed around the stage. Julian was on an island of his own making. Marcus Vance, Julian's son, stepped into the light. His face was a mirror of his father's features, but the expression was entirely different. It was filled with a cold, crystalline clarity. He looked at the screen, then at the broken man on the stage. "You told me she didn't recognize me because of the Alzheimer's," Marcus said, his voice thick with a burgeoning rage. "You told me it was kinder not to visit her, that it only upset her more. You let me believe my own grandmother was gone while she was sitting upstairs, trapped in her own body because of you." "Marcus, son, listen to me," Julian started, reaching out a hand. "Don't," Marcus snapped, recoiling as if his father's touch were toxic. "Don't ever call me that again. I've spent my life trying to earn your respect, trying to be the man you said a Vance should be. I didn't realize that meant being a monster." Julian turned back to the crowd, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He looked for an ally, a single face that wasn't twisted in disgust. He found none. Even the waitresses had stopped moving, their trays held tight, their eyes fixed on the man who had treated them like furniture for a decade. "The board will be convening an emergency session tonight," Arthur said, his voice booming with the authority of a man protecting his own reputation. He didn't look at Julian, he looked at the floor. "Effective immediately, Julian Vance is suspended from all duties. Security will escort him from the premises. We will be cooperating fully with the authorities regarding the treatment of Evelyn Vance." The sound of the word authorities seemed to break Julian completely. He slumped against the podium, the wood creaking under his weight. The man who had bragged about the Vance bloodline being superior to all others now looked like he was made of wet paper. Elena walked toward the stage, her heels clicking on the marble with a rhythmic finality. She stopped just at the edge of the dais, looking up at him. She could smell the sour scent of his sweat now, a sharp contrast to the expensive cologne he had applied so liberally earlier that evening. "You told me once that I didn't belong in this house," Elena said, her voice a cool breeze in the heat of the room. "You said that people like me were just footnotes in the stories of people like you." Julian looked down at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He looked small, he looked finished. "It turns out you were right about one thing, Julian," she continued, reaching out to take the remote for the projector from the podium. She clicked it off, plunging the room into the soft, amber glow of the chandeliers. "I don't belong in this house. But then again, neither do you. The police are waiting in the foyer. Silas has already given them the medical logs." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "Evelyn is awake, Julian, and she remembers everything." The look of pure, unadulterated terror that crossed Julian's face was the most satisfying thing Elena had ever seen. It wasn't just the fear of prison. It was the fear of a man who realized that the person he had tried to erase was the one who held the pen. Without waiting for a response, Elena turned her back on him. She didn't stay to watch the security guards take his arms. She didn't stay to hear his pathetic excuses or his threats of legal retaliation. She walked through the crowd, which parted for her like a sea of silk and wool. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she felt Marcus's gaze on her. He didn't follow her, not yet, but the nod he gave her was one of acknowledgement. The lion had been sleeping, and Julian had made the fatal mistake of thinking it was a rug. Elena stepped out onto the portico, the cool night air hitting her face like a benediction. Behind her, the sounds of the manor, the shouting, the weeping, the frantic phone calls of socialites trying to distance themselves from the blast zone, faded into a dull hum. She walked down the stone steps, her shadow finally her own again. The unraveling was complete, but the rebuilding was only just beginning. She didn't look back at the lights of the house. She looked toward the gates, where the blue and red lights were just beginning to crest the hill. The sirens were no longer a distant hum. They were a screaming reality that shattered the curated silence of the Vance estate. Elena stood on the gravel driveway, her breath hitching in the sharp, nocturnal air as the first patrol car swung through the iron gates. The blue and red strobes sliced through the darkness, turning the manicured boxwoods into jagged, flickering shadows. For 5 years, this property had been a gilded cage, but as the gravel crunched under the weight of authority, it felt like a fortress finally under siege. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the manor burst open. Julian stumbled out onto the portico, his silk tuxedo jacket hanging lopsided on his shoulders. He looked less like the titan of industry he portrayed and more like a cornered animal, his hair disheveled and his eyes darting wildly between Elena and the approaching lights. "You think this is a victory?" Julian's voice cracked, the arrogance that usually bolstered him replaced by a high-pitched, vibrating desperation. He descended the stone steps, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the damp surface. "You've brought the police to my home, Elena. Based on what? A few doctored papers and the word of a senile old woman." Elena didn't flinch as he reached the bottom of the stairs. She watched him with a clinical detachment that seemed to infuriate him more than a scream would have. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath, mixed with the metallic scent of cold sweat. "The blood work doesn't lie, Julian," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "And neither does Dr. Thorne." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a second vehicle pulled up behind the police. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped out, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a shield. Beside him stood a woman in a sharp navy suit, Detective Miller, the lead investigator Elena had been feeding information to for weeks. Julian's face underwent a transformation that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, were now glazed with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. The skin around his jaw tightened until the bones seemed ready to tear through, his complexion shifting from a mottled, angry purple to a sickly, translucent gray. His lower lip trembled, a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that betrayed the collapse of the iron-willed patriarch he had spent decades constructing. Every muscle in his face seemed to have lost its anchor, sagging under the weight of a truth he could no longer scream into submission. The mask of the grieving, dutiful son didn't just slip, it disintegrated. "Detective," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he ignored Elena entirely. "There's been a massive misunderstanding. My wife is. She's been under a tremendous amount of stress. Her mental state is fragile. These accusations are a cry for attention, nothing more." Detective Miller didn't even look at him. She looked at Elena. "Is the victim secured?" "Sila's is with her," Elena replied. "She's in the library. We didn't want to move her until you arrived." Julian lunged forward, his hand snapping out to grab Elena's arm. "You stay away from her. You've poisoned her mind enough." Before his fingers could close around her wrist, a firm hand caught his shoulder. It was Marcus. He had appeared from the shadows of the portico, his face a mask of grim resolve. He didn't look at his father with the usual fear or seeking of approval. He looked at him with a profound, weary disgust. "Stop it, Dad," Marcus said, his voice low and heavy. "It's over. I saw the footage from the hallway cameras, the ones you thought were disabled." Julian froze. His hand dropped to his side. "Marcus, you don't know what you're talking about. I did everything for you, for this family." "You drugged your own mother to steal her voting shares," Marcus countered, stepping between his father and Elena. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. He handed it directly to Detective Miller. "This is the backup of the internal security server. It shows Sila's entering the North Wing with the medication, and it shows you, Dad, signing the disposal logs for the vials that Dr. Thorne never authorized." The silence that followed was absolute, save for the ticking of a cooling car engine. The socialites who had lingered on the lawn, the vultures of high society who had been so quick to mock Elena's modest background, now stood in a wide circle, their faces illuminated by the police lights. They were no longer whispering. They were watching the fall of the House of Vance with the same rapt attention they would give a theater performance. Julian's gaze swept over them, searching for an ally, a friend, a business partner who would step forward and defend him. But the crowd shifted. Men who had shared cigars with him only an hour ago turned their backs. Women who had praised his dedication to his mother's care suddenly found the gravel beneath their feet fascinating. The flip was instantaneous and brutal. In the world Julian had built, weakness was a contagion, and he was now patient zero. "This is a conspiracy," Julian hissed, his voice failing him as the police sergeant moved in. Silas, tell them she made you do it." Silas appeared at the top of the stairs, supporting a frail but remarkably upright Evelyn. The matriarch was wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, her silver hair catching the blue light. She didn't look like a victim of dementia. She looked like a queen returning to a throne that had been occupied by a pretender. "I've spent months in a fog, Julian," Evelyn said, her voice carrying across the lawn with a clarity that silenced the remaining murmurs. "I felt the needle. I heard you whispering to the lawyers while you thought I was asleep. You spoke about the burden of my existence. You spoke about the Vance legacy as if it were a prize you had already won." She leaned on Silas, but her eyes never left her son. "The only burden in this family, Julian, is the shame you've brought upon it." The sergeant stepped forward, the metallic jingle of handcuffs a final, sharp punctuation to the evening. "Julian Vance, you are under arrest for the endangerment of a vulnerable adult, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny." Julian tried to pull away, a final, pathetic burst of resistance that only resulted in him being pressed against the hood of the patrol car. The cold metal against his cheek seemed to finally break his spirit. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He simply deflated, his forehead resting against the police cruiser as the handcuffs clicked shut. Elena walked toward the car. She didn't feel the rush of adrenaline she had expected. She felt a profound, quiet peace. She stopped a few feet away, watching as the man who had tried to erase her identity was forced into the backseat. Julian looked up at her through the glass, his eyes brimming with a venomous, impotent rage. He mouthed something, a curse, a threat, but it didn't matter. The glass was thick and his power was gone. "I told you once that I would remember everything you said to me," Elena said, though he couldn't hear her. "I remembered, and now the world will remember you for exactly what you are." She turned away from the car, ignoring the reporters who were already beginning to swarm the gates. She walked toward Evelyn and Silas. Marcus stood by the stairs, his head bowed, the weight of his father's sins resting on his shoulders. "What happens now?" Marcus asked as Elena reached them. "Now we get your grandmother to a clinic where the doctors aren't on the payroll," Elena said. She looked at the manor, the sprawling, cold monument to Julian's ego. "And then we decide what to do with all this." She didn't stay to watch the police drive Julian away. She didn't stay to hear the apologies of the guests who were now trying to crowd around her, offering their support and claiming they had always suspected something was wrong. She walked past them, her heels clicking rhythmically on the stone, a sound of progress rather than retreat. As she reached the gates, Silas met her with the keys to a small, unassuming sedan she had parked there earlier. She didn't want the Vance limousines. She didn't want the drivers. "The paperwork for the temporary injunction is already being processed, ma'am," Silas whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He won't be coming back, not tonight, not ever." Elena nodded, taking the keys. She glanced back one last time. The manor was still lit up, a beacon in the night, but the life had been drained from it. It was just a house again. She climbed into the car and started the engine. As she pulled out onto the main road, leaving the flashing lights and the crumbling legacy behind, she felt the weight of the last 5 years finally dissolve. But as she reached for her phone to call the legal team, a notification flashed on the screen. A private message from an unknown number sent only minutes ago. "You think you found all the accounts, Elena? Look at the offshore holdings in the Cayman file. Julian wasn't just stealing from his mother. He was hiding something much, much bigger." Elena's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The reckoning was over, but the shadows Julian had cast were longer than she had ever imagined. She pulled over to the side of the road, the silence of the woods surrounding her as she opened the encrypted attachment. The first line of the document made the blood in her veins turn to ice. It wasn't just money. It was a list of names that reached far beyond the Vance family, into the very heart of the city's power structure. Julian hadn't just been a thief, he had been a gatekeeper, and she had just opened the door. 6 months had passed since the gates of the Vance estate last swung shut on the man who had turned a home into a gilded cage. The air in the grand foyer no longer smelled of Julian's heavy, expensive sandalwood cologne, or the medicinal tang of the sedatives he had used to keep his mother a prisoner in her own mind. Instead, the manor breathed with the scent of lemon oil, fresh lavender, and the faint, clean aroma of steaming coffee. Elena Vance stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand resting lightly on the banister. She wasn't wearing the modest, fading clothes of a researcher anymore. Her charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, sharp and professional, yet she wore it with a quiet ease that Julian had never mastered. For him, clothes were armor. For her, they were simply a uniform for the work that finally mattered. Below her, the foyer had been transformed. The heavy, oppressive velvet curtains were gone, replaced by sheer linen that allowed the morning sun to flood the stone floors. A group of contractors moved quietly through the east wing, converting the former ballroom into a state-of-the-art neurorehabilitation center. "The first shipment of equipment arrives at noon," a voice called out from the hallway. Elena turned to see Marcus walking toward her. He looked older, the boyish arrogance that had once defined his features replaced by a steady, sober focus. He held a tablet in one hand and a stack of blueprints in the other. He had spent the last 4 months working 12-hour days, helping Elena dismantle his father's corrupt infrastructure and rebuild it into the Evelyn Vance Foundation. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice warm. "How is your grandmother doing this morning?" "Dr. Thorne says her cognitive scores are up another 10%, he replied, a genuine smile touching his lips. "She's in the garden with Sela's. She actually remembered the name of the roses he was pruning today. The Queen Elizabeth variety." Elena felt a swell of achievement pride. It was a small win, a minor revelation in the grand scheme of medical science, but to see Evelyn Vance regaining the identity Julian had tried to erase was more rewarding than any bank balance. "And the other matter?" Elena asked, her tone shifting. "The list." Marcus's expression darkened. "The names from the gatekeeper files. 3 more board members resigned this morning after the evidence of the offshore holdings hit the press. The city's power structure is leaning, Elena. Without Julian to hold the door open for them, they're all falling like dominoes." "Good," she whispered. "They were the ones who looked the other way while he drained the family dry. They don't get to keep their seats just because he's gone." She moved down the stairs, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, a sound of authority that no longer felt like a performance. She reached the bottom and accepted a folder from Marcus. Inside was a private investigator's report, one she had requested a week ago. She didn't open it immediately. She knew what was inside. It was the documentation of Julian's new reality. 3 miles away, in a part of the city where the streetlights hummed with a flickering, sickly yellow glow, Julian sat at a laminate table in a studio apartment that smelled of damp and stale grease. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the constant thrum of the laundromat downstairs and the muffled shouting of neighbors through the vents. He wore a polyester shirt that had lost its crispness 3 washes ago. His fingers, once adorned with a gold signet ring that had been in the family for generations, were bare. He reached for a plastic cup of lukewarm water, his hand trembling slightly. On the table before him lay a bus pass and a notice from the state's legal aid office. He had spent the morning trying to call his former associates, the men who had toasted his brilliance at $10,000-a-plate dinners. None of them had picked up. Some had changed their numbers, others had simply blocked him. He looked at the small, cracked mirror above the sink. The man staring back looked hollow. The wounded wolf had been stripped of his pack and his territory. He had tried to fight the final court order, shouting about his birthright and his legacy, but the judge, a woman whose own mother had been a victim of Julian's predatory financial schemes, had looked at him with nothing but cold, clinical pity. Julian had lost the Vance name. He had lost the fortune. But the moment of regret porn that haunted him most wasn't the loss of the money. It was the memory of the look on Elena's face when she had walked out of the boardroom for the last time. She hadn't looked back. She hadn't even looked angry. She had looked at him as if he were a ghost, a lingering shadow that had finally been chased away by the light. He picked up the bus pass, his knuckles white. He had an interview for a data entry position at a logistics firm. It paid minimum wage. It was a role for someone he would have previously considered invisible. Now, he was the one who didn't belong. Back at the manor, Elena stepped out onto the terrace. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the coming autumn. She saw Silas in the distance, his back bent as he tended to the flower beds. Beside him, in a wheelchair but sitting upright and alert, was Evelyn. The older woman was pointing at a butterfly, her laughter thin but clear, drifting across the lawn. Elena felt a sharp, bittersweet pang in her chest. She had won. The justice was proportional, the karma instant and devastating. She had protected the woman Julian had tried to destroy, and redeemed the son Julian had tried to corrupt. But as she looked at the empty space where Julian's portrait had once hung in the hallway, she felt the weight of the cost. She had lost the brother she thought she knew. She had lost the innocence of believing that blood was a shield against betrayal. The manor was a place of healing now, but the scars in the foundation would always remain. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped out onto the terrace, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to her, his eyes searching hers. "You're thinking about the list again," he said quietly. "I'm thinking about how many people it takes to keep a secret that big," Elena replied, taking a sip. The cold liquid was a sharp contrast to the warmth of the sun. "Julian wasn't just a thief, Eris. He was a symptom of a much larger rot. I've spent 6 months cutting it out, but I wonder if the soil is still tainted." "The soil is what you make of it," Thorne said, gesturing to the garden. "Look at Marcus. Look at your mother. You didn't just take the house back, Elena. You changed the atmosphere." She nodded, but her gaze drifted toward the gate. She had achieved victory euphoria, yes, but it was tempered by the knowledge of the shadows Julian had cast. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver key, the one Silas had given her on the night she decided to fight back. She walked to the edge of the terrace and looked down at the key. It represented the moment she stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. It was the key to a house that was no longer a prison. A car pulled up to the gate, a delivery vehicle for the medical wing. Elena watched as the gate swung open, smooth and silent. "Elena," Marcus called from the door. "The legal team is on line 1. They found another account. It's not Julian's. It's under a name we didn't expect." Elena's grip tightened on the silver key. The reckoning was over, but the mysteries of the Vance legacy were like the roots of the old oaks on the property, deeper and more twisted than anyone realized. She turned away from the sun, stepping back into the cool shade of the foyer. She had her victory, she had her justice, and she had her new life. But as she picked up the phone, she realized that the door she had opened 6 months ago was one that could never be fully closed again. The final image of the morning was the sight of Elena Vance standing in the center of her new world, the silver key gleaming in her hand, while the ghost of the man who had once owned it all sat in a silent, cramped room, listening to the sound of a world that had moved on without him. She was no longer the sleeping lion. She was the master of the pride, and the hunt for the truth was only just beginning.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.